Hello, welcome to this episode of Midlife Men with me, Philip Briscoe. Today, I'm talking to Adrian de Coursey. We're going to be talking about how to navigate transitions in life, finding your purpose, looking at how you manage change, especially change in your career, and then how you need to develop resilience to cope with that. And Adrian's going to share his experiences with us. So welcome, Adrian.
Hi, Philip. It's great to be here. I'm a huge fan of the podcast, so I'm delighted to join as a guest.
Great. Thank you. Good to have you here. Let's start by talking about your early career and where things started.
So my early career was very corporate. So after graduating from university, I joined KPMG, a large global accounting consultancy company. I worked on the consultancy side, and then I moved into strategy roles with Shell and later at Johnson & Johnson. So it was a mix of strategy, corporate. I had an insight into how large corporations work. And then my career, as you alluded to earlier, took a pivot when I moved back from my position working for Johnson & Johnson in Switzerland to the UK to take over a small family business. My parents are immigrants to the UK, and they built up a very small business, and they suffered a number of health concerns. Back in 2008, 2009, my dad had to go into hospital for a quadruple heart bypass and aortic valve replacement. And my mum had cancer. They were actually in the same hospital at the same time having treatment and were unable to manage the business. So I took a sabbatical from my position in Switzerland to manage it, initially on a part-time basis, and then took over fully.
So, obviously, there are obvious reasons why you decided to do that to help your parents, especially with their poor health at the time. But having had a successful career, how did you adapt from working, living in Switzerland to then taking over the family business, which is, I imagine, quite a different type of experience?
You're right. They were very, very different experiences. So my job in Switzerland involved a lot of international travel, and it was quite a glamorous job. You're traveling business class, you're seeing the world courtesy of a corporate account. You're working on some quite challenging, but also intellectually stimulating projects. And it's a very global position. While I moved back to my home city in the UK, which is a small provincial city in the Midlands, and you're dealing with, this was a small business. So, you're dealing a lot more with the nitty gritty aspects of growing a business. I actually had that experience quite early on, though, because I'm an only son. And as my parents were, bootstrapping the business, it was discussed at the family breakfast and dinner table. So I had a good insight into it early on. In mindset, I very much knew it, but it was more you're starting from a different base, because when you work for a large corporate, you are a small cog in a massive wheel. When you join a small SME business, you are the wheel. So it is quite different, but it's also very exciting as well.
And what sort of challenges did you face?
So it was challenging in the sense that I joined the business during the great financial crisis. And this was a business that had been quite badly impacted by the financial crisis. So I very much had a burning platform, and there were pros and cons to that. By having a burning platform, it's easier to bring about change because there's no alternative, but also managing and turning around the business during a financial crisis is challenging, especially when the banks weren't always supportive at the beginning. You have to build credibility. I had not been in the business for a long time. I mean, I grew up with it as a child, but had not been active in it for a long time. So people didn't really know me. I come from outside, come from this sort of corporate career where to some people, I was very different from my dad. So you have to build bonds, gain people's confidence, build credibility. Also, you're working across all aspects of the business because it's an SME business. So you're doing everything from the numbers, the finance, cash flow, to the operational, to branding, to marketing, to looking at the strategic direction and long term of the company. So it's very much hands on. exciting, but definitely challenging.
And did you find, how did you find, the stresses that you experienced through running the business, especially through, difficult financial external environments? How did you find them impacting you as a person?
They definitely took a toll in a number of ways. So the business had always been quite light in terms of the management. My dad had done a huge amount himself. So when you then step into those shoes, there's an adrenaline that kicks in the beginning because it's all hands to the wheel in managing the business and getting to grips with it. But at the same time, there's only so many hours in the day. And I was someone who would burn the candle at both ends. So be getting up at 4:35 in the morning, but often being working until midnight and so on. And what I found was the business seeps into every aspect of your life. And it was very difficult at times to be able to switch off. I was very bad at being able to I basically did not have a work-life balance. And I think that is damaging in the long term. You can manage, you can get by in the short term, but medium to long term, that definitely takes a toll.
And so what sort of coping mechanisms did you put in place?
So I should be very honest. Initially, there was no real coping mechanisms. It was an all-in mentality of just trying to do everything. But obviously, I learned that that's not sensible. And over time, I have developed coping mechanisms. One is I try to be more strict with my time. So I like to plan out my day and week as much as possible. Now, in a entrepreneurial life, it's impossible to really plan everything tightly, but you can put guidelines in place. So I no longer really work very late into the evening because I know that impacts my sleep because it will be on my mind before going to bed. I've also learned to meditate, although I need to be honest with you, and that's always a work in progress. So I use an app called Healthy Minds, which I find very useful, but I'm not great at meditating. But I find if I do it before bed, in a way, it cleans out the sort of garbage of the day and you're able to go to bed with a clean and empty mind. And the other aspect is I took my personal health and fitness more seriously. So I try and do the sort of obvious stuff like 30 press-ups a day, 10,000 steps. I go to the gym. I try and look after myself more. So it's about physical and mental health.
So let's talk a bit about building resilience then, which is, a core skill that anyone needs in life. Perhaps you can talk a bit about your experience.
Building resilience is incredibly important. I think whatever path of life you're on, whether it's a corporate career or a entrepreneurial journey, the way I try and build resilience is by looking after myself, but also being incredibly objective. And I would say brutally objective and honest as well, because there will always be challenges coming at you in whatever you do in life, but you need to find a way to navigate around those challenges and to remember that it's okay. Let's take whenever there's a challenge, break it down to bite-sized chunks and tackle each of those chunks.
That's really interesting, actually, because I think often, do you think you have to be in a good place, so to speak, to be able to handle and create that sort of mindset? I mean, if you're in a state of high stress, you're wondering how you're going to cope. Do you think it's as easy to manage those sorts of coping mechanisms and resilience building?
So it's definitely not easy. And it can be quite hard to be brutally objective and honest with yourself. I think it's much harder to do it if you're going through a period of emotional turmoil and so on. So I think to manage that resilience, it really does begin with managing yourself. You have to manage yourself correctly, and then you become more resilient.
In terms of, I guess, balancing your work and personal life, what are your experiences of managing to do that successfully, especially running quite an intense business, which is taking a lot of your own effort and involvement?
This is difficult. I think there's no easy answer. It requires great honesty between you and your partner and family. It also, you do need to actually be able to compartmentalize and have blocks of time that you keep free. So what I did definitely struggled with was in the beginning, I never compartmentalized the time. So everything would get mixed up. And then what then happens is often because the work issues are more prioritized, your family, your partner actually takes second place. And that's not fair to them. And that only builds up problems later. So the way to do this, I've found, is actually being quite structured and limiting or compartmentalizing the time, and also being as productive and focused as you can be. The other thing I've learned to do is I try and begin my day with what I call as the MIT. So the MIT I define as the most important task. Now that would be the night before, looking at my day ahead. And obviously there'll be lots of challenges in every day. So this will change. But what is the key activity I need to do tomorrow to make the day a win for me? What is that most important task? And actually then beginning the day with that if possible. Because if you don't begin the day with that most important task, it will probably be on your mind, and it may actually then seep into the next day and so on. When, I'm somebody who's very focused on delivery and just getting stuff done. And so I find planning the day and knowing the MIT, the most important task, very important. It helps me.
And we talked a little bit about change earlier, but how do you think, you've experienced quite a lot of change in your career and your life. What are your rules for managing change or adapting to change?
So the only really constant in our lives is change. So I might be unusual in that I've never really feared change, because we live in a world of constant change, and I find change exciting. What's important is to actually understand the change. So I would never be opposed to change. I would first want to really understand what the change is, how it impacts me or my interests, family, business, and so on. And then go with it and try and optimize it, basically.
And how well do you think you need to really understand yourself in order to cope with things like change and build resilience and be more, I guess, in control of your own destiny? How much is self-discovery key to that?
I think self-awareness and self-discovery is absolutely crucial. You can't really successfully navigate your own path unless you know yourself. Otherwise, you are like a ship constantly buffeted by waves in the sea and approaching every storm. You need to know your strengths and weaknesses, what you want, and approximately where you want to go and who you want to be in, say, 5 to 10 years. And this can be done in a loose sense. So nobody can really plan out the future accurately, but you can have a sense of what you want to do. And I think the danger here is actually people sleepwalk through life unless they really understand themselves. And I should also say that it's quite hard to understand yourself. So what's helped me is actually my wife. My wife is somebody she's brutally honest and she's very objective. So I may think I'm good at something and she will say, no, you're not. This is what you're better at. And actually that helps. So what I would say is, in order to really know yourself and your strengths, it's not just about what you think. I would suggest asking the people closest to you who know you best. And that may be your life partner. It may be friends from school or so on, or people you work with, colleagues. But ask people who've known you for a significant period of time.
And what have you learned about yourself?
Okay, that's a big question. So One of the things that I never really appreciated before was my ability to simplify messages, to be articulate, to be persuasive, because I've always found public speaking quite easy. I've never had the anxiety of a public speaking and so on, but my wife is less confident in interviews, in public speaking and so on. And because I found it quite easy or without too much of an effort, I've not really valued it. While my wife actually, because she finds it difficult, she seems to think that I'm better at it and sees it as a strength. Well, it's something that I have not appreciated before. I've also learned a lot about my own discipline. Discipline is important. So I think in life, you need to have the combination of being able to be flexible and flex to changes, to manage change. But you also need to there needs to be an element of structure and discipline to your life as well. And I've learned the importance of that through my wife.
And you talked a little bit earlier about perhaps being stuck or following paths that perhaps don't suit your personality and your goals in life. What advice do you give to those people that are feeling stuck, especially perhaps in midlife where you've got financial commitments, perhaps you haven't got the ability to jump and do something else because you need to support yourself and others? What advice do you have on, it's all very well kind of knowing yourself and what you want, but you can feel that that's not possible to obtain?
I think the way to then do it is to be practical. So take a multi-step process. The first step is looking at what you want to do. So Philip, in your case, you want to do the podcast. You know the podcast is going to take up elements of your time. So it's about planning that and also ensuring that you or anyone else has the resources in place to make those other commitments. So we're all in midlife, both of us and people listening to this probably. And it's likely then that people have family commitments, married, children, and so on. So you might not be able to make that pivot or jump immediately, but you can plan to do it. Financial planning, putting some funds aside, making sure you have the financial ability to make that jump. The other thing I would say is you don't have to make any jump suddenly. You can spend 6 months, a year doing something as a side hustle. There's many great businesses that began as side hustles, people testing out the market, seeing if there's an appetite for what they do before going in. So I would say it's not a case of someone instantly jumping. It's a case of putting in place the building blocks to do that pivot.
And are there any kind of other podcasts or philosophies in life that you kind of try and live by, or you find useful and you could pass on?
Yes, so I'm a huge podcast listener. So I like to walk a lot and I listen to a number of podcasts. The ones I listen to, including your own, of course, I listen to Tim Ferriss, and I find, although the episodes are quite long, often between 2 and 3 hours, there is a lot to learn from them. So if I give you an example, I've mentioned how I've struggled to meditate and so on. And it's a constant work in progress. And I learned some tips from one I listened to a few weeks ago. And I also like learning about people's journeys. I'm always fascinated by people we all struggle in life to some extent, but people who've achieved success on their paths. And what's really important is nobody ever follows the entirely straight path in life. There's always pivots. There's always going to be issues. And it's actually learning from the example of others.
And in terms of any other well-known figures who might provide advice, who else do you get lessons from?
So one person who I try and take some inspiration from is Charlie Munger. He's a famous US investor, and he was the partner of Warren Buffett in Berkshire Hathaway. And there's a famous quote, which I try and live by. And the quote is this: spend each day trying to be a little wiser than you were when you woke up. Day by day, at the end of the day, if you live long enough, you will get out of life what you deserve. So I try and spend each day being a little bit wiser before I go to bed than when I started the day.
So looking back on your journey so far, what would you do differently?
This is an interesting question. What I would have liked to have done differently is to know myself more earlier. I may have done things slightly differently and explored other options. I would probably also have at the beginning spent more time looking round than actually before committing to certain paths. But on the whole, there's not a huge amount I would have changed because, I see life as a work in progress and we're both midlife. So there's a huge opportunity ahead of us to be whoever we want to be and follow whatever path, so this is a question where we have an exciting opportunity ahead of us because we have time.
Any moments stand out more vividly than others for you in terms of, looking back at lessons learned?
I definitely think I probably, with my parents being ill and moving back to the UK to manage a family business was very much a turning moment in my life because if I'd simply followed a corporate career, my next move was to Singapore. And at that stage, you're very much on a corporate path and you were climbed a ladder. So that was definitely a turning point. But I learned a huge amount about it. I mean, I grew the business quite substantially, helped it win a Queen's Award for Enterprise. And this was one of the top 1,000 companies to inspire Britain in a survey. So they're achievements I would not have been able to do in a corporate career. So that's definitely a turning point. My marriage as well. So as I mentioned, my wife is a truly exceptional person. So I'm genuinely lucky to have found her. And I'm enormously, happy to have married her. So she's an amazing person. But honestly, I wouldn't really change a lot. And the key turning points are career-wise, definitely moving back into family business, and personal life would be my wife.
Just from an entrepreneur's perspective then, I mean, many people listening to this will either be entrepreneurs, maybe of large businesses or maybe just small ones, perhaps one-man bands or even wanting to, start their own business. And we've talked a bit about, the kind of qualities that you need to live, I guess, in order to be successful. But what would you say is a kind of shared quality for success, I guess, for being an entrepreneur?
By far the most important one is resilience, because the entrepreneurial journey is not easy. And most successful entrepreneurs have actually failed. When I think of entrepreneurship, it reminds me of a Japanese saying about getting knocked down 7 times and getting up 8. Building a business from scratch or even going into one midway, they're difficult, they're challenging, and it requires a certain type of person, because if you are going down your entrepreneurial route, it means you become a jack of all trades, because you've got to look at everything from business development to finance to operations to health and safety to, it's a very all-encompassing path. So I definitely think you need to be resilient. I would also say the other 2 qualities are an ability to be flexible and change your mind, because there's a saying by the economist Keynes that when the facts change, I change my mind. You will often, as an entrepreneur, try different avenues, different goods or services which may not work, and you will need to pivot quite a lot. So you need to be flexible in your mindset. And the third aspect I'd say is you need to be brutally honest with yourself and objective. So objectivity is really, really important. If something's not working, you need to cut it quick and move on.
Do you think you have to learn by your mistakes? This is all great advice for people listening, but do you think you only really learn by making, a mistake and then pivoting from that?
Yes. So I have an MBA, and an MBA is great, but an MBA is very theoretical. And I learned a huge amount more by making mistakes. I learned far less by areas where I've been successful, but when I've failed, it's been sore, it's been painful. You have the scars on your back, they're scorched, on my mind. So, you have to make mistakes. It could be expensive. It's like entrepreneurship is like an expensive MBA in some ways. But fundamentally, yes, you have to make those mistakes. So I would say, don't worry about making the mistakes. It's okay as long as you learn from them.
Do you think anyone can become an entrepreneur? Can anyone start their own venture?
My honest answer is probably not. And it's because it depends on the business and it depends on the sector and the time and so on. But if you want to scale up a business, it does require immense energy, resilience, and a laser focus. And I think it's very hard if you're scaling up a business that your family won't be impacted, at least emotionally, because you won't be able to commit as much time to them as you would want to. So it depends on what type of business you want to build. I'm an ambitious and competitive person. So for me, it would always be all in. And actually, that's difficult. And you need to have an honest discussion with your family as well. It's easier to be an entrepreneur when you're younger, when you have less commitments.
And people listening to this podcast, and perhaps they're feeling a kind of an impasse, or there's something that they're struggling to deal with, or maybe, they are just feeling stuck and they know they're perhaps following the wrong path in their career and they want to do something else. And you've given a lot of advice, but, at very high level, what would that one piece of advice be?
To do it if they're serious and if they want to make the pivot to do it, and to do it for the following reason. We only have one life. If you're an accountant, for example, and you want to be an artist, that's a very different path. You will regret it if you don't do it. So my advice will be to do it. But my advice would also be to put in place the fallback mechanisms to ensure that you have the financial security for your family, and not to just jump instantly, to actually plan the pivot. And be willing to also set out a timeline, so of maybe a year, 2 years. So take the time to actually make sure it's a success.
Let's talk a bit about the importance of self-care and mental well-being.
Self-care is really, really important. It's something that I neglected for a long time. And I'm happy to tell you what I do. So meditation is important to me. I meditate between 10 and 20 minutes a day. I find it useful in just blocking out the noise and calming the mind. It's not something I'm naturally good at because I have a sort of monkey mind. I have lots of thoughts going through my mind, and to actually be able to make some clear space and block out those thoughts and being able to do it is really important, but it's a skill you develop over time.
For those that don't know what that means, can you just explain a bit more? What are you actually doing when you're meditating?
So what I do is I just basically try to put the focus of my mind on the flow of air in and out of my nose. So in the normal day-to-day of life, we will always have a backtrack in our mind telling us, we're late for something or we should do X, Y, Z. I just try and clear all that out for 20 minutes and just focus on the airflow. It means that you do have to focus. When thoughts come into my head, I just say, I mentally say to myself, I acknowledge that, but now's not the time. And I basically then go back to the airflow. In the beginning, it was really hard. So I began as probably the worst meditator in the world because I literally couldn't do it for like a minute or two. And it doesn't work every time. It's actually not easy, but over time, you get to a place where actually it's almost serene, where you have this clarity. And I find that clarity quite calming, quite peaceful. It's very helpful for me, especially in a modern world where there's a lot of chaos and there's a lot of noise out there. And I think what's really important is you don't want to be subject to the noise, dip in and out of it, but you want to be on your own journey. And meditation helps just calm the mind and bring clarity.
And then what about other other methods. We talked a little bit about the concept of a digital sunset before we started recording. Do you want to expand a bit on that?
I'm a huge fan of a digital sunset. I think we live in a very much on-demand culture. And I have, Apple products. I have the iWatch, and I always find it quite annoying when the notifications and so on. And I don't want to always be subject to the demands of, the outside world. So what I do is at night, about an hour before going to bed, I will switch my phone off. I use an app to block out the notifications, and also the app closes down the access to websites and so on and apps. So I actually can't go on. So it's a sort of enforced sunset, but I find it useful because it helps me sleep better. And it means that you get like an hour to do something else, to watch TV, talk to your family, have some meaningful downtime at night. The other thing I would say is on the meditation, because it's not easy, I download a free app called Healthy Minds, which I use. It's very helpful. It's for all levels, but it's a very good way to experiment with meditation as a beginner.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for sharing your advice, for sharing your story. We'll put a link to that app as well in the description. But thank you for joining us, Adrian.
No, thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be on your podcast. As I said, I'm a huge fan. And yeah, I very much look forward to listening to more episodes in the future.
Thank you for tuning in to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. I hope Adrian's story resonated with you and provided some practical insights. As you mentioned, the Healthy Minds app is free to download and use. Feel free to check it out as an additional resource on your mental well-being journey. If you have a story to tell, and you think your experience would help others, then please get in contact either via the website, mid-lifemen.com, or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. If you enjoyed listening, then please do rate and review the podcast. It really does help get spreading the word and reaching more people who might benefit from the stories shared by my guests. Finally, there's now a book called Men Speak Up, Journeys Through Mental Health, based on the podcast, and it's available to buy on Amazon and through other online retailers.